Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're taking a fascinating, entirely data-driven look at the fiscal health of the United States. You can kind of think of this as a medical diagnosis for the U.S. economy. We're going to check the patient's baseline vitals, examine some of those acute symptoms that always seem to flare up in Washington, and then, most importantly, we're going to look at 3 distinct, scientifically modeled treatment plans. And this is all based on some incredible data from the Peterson Foundation and the Penn Wharton budget model. There's a lot of noise out there when it comes to the economy, but today, we're just letting the numbers do the talking.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. 1, the basics, debt versus deficit. 2, the debt ceiling explained. 3, option 1, taxing the wealthy. 4, option 2, reforming entitlements. 5, option 3, broad-based taxes. And finally, 6, choosing our economic future. Let's dive right in.
Section 1, the basics, debt versus deficit. So first things first, we need to establish the patient's baseline vitals by clearing up 2 terms that, let's be honest, are constantly confused in the news. The easiest way to think about this is like a credit card. The deficit, that's your monthly overspending. It's the annual mismatch where the government is simply spending more than it takes in through revenue and taxes. The debt, on the other hand, is your total accumulated balance over time. Now, historically, deficits usually only spike during wars or really severe recessions. But today, as the Peterson Foundation notes, deficits have basically become the structural norm. And that's due to an aging population, rising healthcare costs, and just mounting interest payments. Right now, Uncle Sam's credit card is practically melting. To really grasp the sheer scale of this condition, consider this. By the end of fiscal year 2024, the total debt held by the public was a staggering $28.2 trillion. To put that massive number into perspective, that is roughly 98% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. So the baseline trajectory? It's simply unsustainable.
Section 2, the debt ceiling explained. Now that we know our baseline, let's take a look at those acute flare-ups that happen in Washington.
Okay, so what exactly is the debt ceiling? Well, the absolutely crucial point here is that raising the ceiling doesn't actually authorize a single dime of new spending. It doesn't work like that. It simply allows the Treasury to pay the bills for things the government has already bought. Basically, it's just a cap on borrowing to meet existing legal obligations. Today, after the passage of the recent Big Beautiful Bill, which suspended or raised previous limits, the current U.S. debt ceiling stands at $41.1 trillion. It's an aggregate limit applied to nearly all federal debt. And historically, this tension has built up over time. What started way back in 1917, just as a tool to flexibly fund World War I, has unfortunately turned into a recurring political football. And these standoffs, they have real-world consequences. I mean, back in 2011, just a delay in raising the limit resulted in the very first downgrade of the United States' credit rating, which literally sent markets tumbling. It's essentially a high-stakes game of chicken that regularly threatens the U.S. economy with default.
Now, this sparks a genuinely fascinating constitutional debate. Some legal scholars and even some lawmakers point straight to the 14th Amendment. They argue that a default is actually unconstitutional, suggesting the debt ceiling itself might be legally flawed if it forces a default. However, relying on this kind of constitutional workaround to avoid a crisis, well, that remains highly controversial and completely legally untested. So if our current path of skyrocketing debt is unsustainable and playing with the debt ceiling is dangerous, we need some concrete solutions. And this brings us to 3 distinct policy bundles modeled by the experts at the Penn Wharton budget model. And here's the cool part. They constrained their models to ensure that these treatments would reduce the deficit without shrinking the economy compared to our current path. Section 3, option 1, taxing the wealthy. Let's look at our very first treatment option, which focuses on raising revenues primarily from corporations and high-income households. Think of this one as an aggressive targeted therapy. It strictly targets higher earners. It would raise the top ordinary income tax rate to 45%, tax capital gains at ordinary rates, and bump the corporate tax rate up from 21% to 28%. It also doubles the Social Security taxable maximum earnings threshold. And, interestingly enough, this bundle also includes the implementation of paid family leave. Researchers found this specific benefit was pretty much universally supported by proponents of this exact tax approach. So what's the diagnosis for this treatment? Well, it generates a solid $3.7 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years, and it brings the debt-to-GDP ratio down to 186% by 2054. However, macroeconomic performance over the next 30 years actually differs very little from our current baseline. GDP and average wages just remain flat. Why?
Well, because the economic gains we'd normally get from reducing the national debt are essentially canceled out by the economic distortions and disincentives caused by those significantly higher tax rates. Section 4, Option 2, Reforming Entitlements. Our second treatment plan takes a completely different approach, focusing heavily on spending reductions in mandatory programs. This bundle dramatically reshapes the social safety net as we know it. It gradually raises the Social Security retirement age to 70 and the Medicare age to 67. But most profoundly, it flattens Social Security benefits over time straight to the poverty line. So it effectively transforms it for younger generations into a strict poverty relief program rather than a guaranteed retirement pension. It also converts Medicare to a premium support system and limits tax exclusions for employer-sponsored health insurance. Now, the side effect of this harsh medicine is really fascinating. This option reduces the 10-year deficit by $3.4 trillion. But check out the growth. It generates a massive 9.8% increase in GDP by 2054. How does that work? Because this option significantly cuts future entitlement benefits, households anticipate the change. They know it's coming, so they are forced to replace that lost retirement income with their own private savings. And this massive influx of private savings spurs tremendous capital investment and increases labor supply, which grows the overall economy significantly, eventually bringing the debt down to 152% of GDP. Section 5. Option 3. Broad-based taxes. Finally, let's explore the third treatment plan, which shares the burden across a much wider segment of the population through broad-based taxes and cuts. This bundle introduces entirely new revenue streams for the U.S. We're talking about things like a 1% value-added tax or VAT on consumption and a $50 per ton carbon tax. It also removes almost all itemized tax deductions except for charity. Over on the spending side, it makes targeted trims by indexing Social Security to a slower growth metric called chained CPI, which effectively reduces benefit growth over time. It also increases Medicare premiums for lower income brackets to match the second tier. By casting a wider net, this option rapidly raises revenue. In fact, it achieves the largest 10-year deficit reduction of all three bundles, a whopping $6 trillion. It lowers the debt to 146% of GDP by 2054, and it boosts GDP by 5.9%, which benefits from both the immediate implementation of the broad taxes and, surprisingly, long-term productivity gains from lower carbon emissions driven by that carbon tax. Section 6. Choosing our economic future. We've looked at the baseline diagnosis, and we've explored three very different treatments, so let's put them head to head. Comparing these side by side reveals a pretty stark reality for us. Absolutely none of these bundles are large enough to completely stabilize the debt, which really just shows you exactly how deep this fiscal hole is. Our current baseline? That takes us to a dangerous 217% debt to GDP. Option 1 targets the wealthy, reducing debt modestly but stalling growth. Option 2 slashes entitlements, shrinking debt while forcing private savings that actually cause GDP to soar. And Option 3 spreads the pain widely with consumption taxes, achieving the lowest debt level and moderate economic growth. So here's what you should really take away from this explainer. The math is undeniable, and the cure is going to require some very real, potentially painful medicine. Every single path forward requires a sacrifice, whether that's higher taxes on businesses and top earners, a delayed retirement with vastly reduced safety nets, or broad consumption fees that hit absolutely everyone's wallet. So I'll leave you with this question to think about. What is the price you are willing to pay for a healthy economy? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the data.